So for the last several years, I've been attempting to find and explore the oldest mines in what is today the United States. And I call this the Lost Mines Project, because as you can guess, many of these mines have been completely lost to history and are buried under soil erosion and just lost to time. To show off my finds during this project, I created a YouTube series called Mines and Mysteries. And this is an ongoing series. With each find we make, we create a new episode. But today, I'd like to talk about the top 10 most memorable moments in the Lost Mines Project. The moments where something unexpected happened, or a great moment where a find was made after months and months or even years of research. And I'm actually going to save the best for last, and number 10 will be my most memorable moment in this project. So let's start this off with the oldest mine that I've ever explored, the Tantausquis Black Lead Mine in Massachusetts. And this mine dates back to 1644 and was worked by an early New England alchemist named John Winthrop Jr. And he was originally working this mine for silver. He hoped that the proceeds from this mine would help found a center of alchemy in a town in Connecticut that he founded called New London. And we explored this mine using an ROV to go down into the water and see what's left in the flooded workings of this mine. Now, this flooded section probably doesn't date back to the time of John Winthrop Jr. I believe it was only worked to a depth of about 14 feet in the 1600s, but we wanted to find out what was left at the mine. So my friend Michael Gerard sent his ROV down into the flooded workings of the mine, and immediately we started finding artifacts and remnants from a long time ago. We found an old ladder and possibly a windlass, but we pushed on with the ROV into these tunnels that were still propped up with timber. We were basically going under a false floor, so if you looked up you would see the timbers that made up the floor for a level above us. So as we were going down this tunnel, we encountered a completely alien sight, something that I have never seen before, and it was a curtain of this otherworldly slime hanging down and blocking the tunnel. It certainly had taken us aback a little bit when we encountered this slime, and we did not push on through it because we didn't want to disturb it, and we will at some point go back and take a sample of the slime using the claw on the ROV and determine exactly what this slime is. So now let's talk about the number 2 most memorable moment. It actually involves another mine thought to be associated with the alchemist John Winthrop Jr. And this time we're in Middletown, Connecticut, where in 1661, John Winthrop Jr. was essentially granted the rights to all the mines in the town. So doing some research led me up to this ravine, and I found what I thought was maybe a tunnel entrance, but it was really hard to discern. There were a lot of roots growing into it, which made digging very difficult. But I had a pretty good feeling about this, so I started digging in and kind of hacking my way through these roots. Finally, I determined it actually was a tunnel, and I could see in and I could see the walls of the tunnel, which I got pretty excited about. So the next day I came back with my friend Steve, and we finished hacking our way through these roots just enough that a person could squeeze into the tunnel. So as soon as I squeezed in and kind of got my bearings, I looked up.
There is a snake in here.
And there was an enormous snake on the wall of the mine. And Steve noted that this was a rat snake, which is not poisonous, and it was simply hanging out, just trying to stay warm and not bothering us. So we proceeded into the mine by walking directly underneath the snake and continued to explore the mine. We've seen lots of other animals in the mines, but this was the most memorable just because of the pure shock of having squeezed into this very tight opening, having looked up and just saw this snake sitting there. I have seen a porcupine in a mine before, but we had lots of space to put between us and the porcupine, and we just completely left him alone and backed out of the mine. But with the snake, it was just right in your face, just something right out of Indiana Jones. So the third most memorable moment was actually in a mine in New York State, and I was researching the mines on Phillipsburg Manor. So in the late 1600s, Phillips had purchased this enormous tract of land in what is today Dutchess and Putnam County from a Dutch patroon, and in 1693 became the lord of the manor. So it's crazy to think that here in colonial America, we had lords like in England. You don't find that in New England at all. But over in New York, it was a different story. And we know that there were mines on Phillipsburg Manor. We know that in the 1760s, Benjamin Franklin actually came up to this area to view a silver mine that was being worked on Phillipsburg Manor. So my research into this very early time led me to this mine. The mine was mentioned in the documents of the colony of New York, and it was said to be a very ancient mine. So I'm interpreting this as meaning that it could date back to the time of the Phillipses, or even before, to the time of New Netherland and the Dutch occupation. So we decided to check this mine out. It was worked all the way up to the 1900s. So again, what we were seeing in this exploration was not the same space that would have been seen during colonial times, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't explore and document each and every one of these sites. So the bottom of the mine is flooded, and we lowered some kayaks down into the water. So once we were in the kayaks, we paddled southwest, and we followed this tunnel until eventually reaching a dead end. And of course I was filming this whole time, and Mike was in front of me with a kayak, and I mentioned that he should just go up and check out what's at the top of the ledge, and I think he mentioned that it looked like a dead end, but he jumped out of the kayak, went up to the top of the ledge, and he found an old time capsule. So when we opened the time capsule, we found that it was dated 1967, and some kids from Mahwah, New Jersey had explored the mine back in 1967 and left this note stating, "You are not the first ones here," and they all signed their name to it and their addresses. And someday it would be actually really interesting to look these guys up and see if any of them are still around. So the fourth most memorable moment was actually back over in Connecticut, and we're exploring an old copper mine dating back to the early 1700s. And it was mentioned that this mine was large enough to contain a dwelling house. So that told me that there was a pretty significant space underground at this site, but what we were seeing did not match up to this description at all. So I was kind of probing around in the mine, and I found a pile of loose rock that I began digging through. So while I was digging through this pile of rock, just shifting it out of the way, I heard off in the distance big boulders crashing down and landing in what sounded like very deep water. Oh, did you hear that? Wow. I've never heard anything like it. So this was a very startling moment because I didn't expect to hear sounds off in the distance just from digging through a pile of loose rock. So we now knew where that lost section of the mine in fact was. We needed to dig through this rock. So after several days of digging, we dug through the tunnel and could see the other side. So when we crawled through to the other side, we found a deep water-filled winze leading straight down. So of course we sent the ROV into the water, and we came to a tunnel which continued on quite a ways before eventually entering into an abyss of just blackness. This must have been the space that was said to be large enough to hold the dwelling house. And the mine continued on from there. We followed a ladder down into more tunnels until we got the ROV stuck and were running low on battery power, and finally retrieved the ROV from the mine. But I'll never forget the sound of those big rocks falling on the other side of this pile of loose rock, just telling us that there's something back there and we need to find out what. And all of our hard digging certainly paid off. So the fifth most memorable moment in this project was the first time that I used an iPhone 12 to Lidar map a tunnel. So previously we had been mapping the tunnels that we would find using a tape measure and a compass. So as soon as the iPhone came out with Lidar, I immediately purchased an iPhone 12 Pro Max and began mapping these tunnels. So the first map that I made was actually in a mine in the Shawangunk Mountains. So the app had actually crashed a couple times during the mapping process, but I learned to move a little bit quicker and not linger on the details. I exited the mine, rendered the map, and I could not believe what I saw. It gave me the length, the height, the width of the mine. It gave me a perfect layout of the different tunnels in a three-dimensional fashion. And all this with just the Lidar on my phone. So that was certainly a moment of excitement, seeing this three-dimensional map of the tunnels of this mine. And we have been using the iPhone Lidar ever since for mapping every single mine we encounter. And we actually post the maps on my Sketchfab page if you want to check out some of the mines that we have mapped in the Lost Mines project. You can check out the Sketchfab page in the link below. So since that time, I actually came up with a few other ways of using the iPhone. One way is actually to find how close two unconnected spaces are to each other. So if you simply map one of the underground spaces, exit, walk across the surface, enter another underground space, and map that, you can see the relationship of these two spaces to each other. But there are even more uses. So another use is to map the height, width, and length of a tailings pile. So a mound of rock sitting on the surface, if you scan the entire pile, you will generate a length, width, and height by calculating the cubic feet of material that is on the surface. You could essentially determine how much underground tunnel space you might find by digging open a mine. And of course, this is not always accurate. Some of the rock could have been ore that was hauled off site, and some of the rock could have been left in the mine and simply gobbed up. But whatever you find on this tailings pile on the outside of the mine is sure to be representative of a space underground. So the sixth most memorable moment was actually at a copper mine in Connecticut that dates back to 1731. And the adit to this mine is completely obliterated. There's no sign where it could possibly be. The shaft is still there, represented by just a low sinkhole. So I went to the Connecticut Historical Society and I actually turned up a map of this mine from the 1800s. So using this map, I was able to take a bearing off the shaft, compensate for declination, which is the change between true and magnetic north, and this changes over time. So in the 1830s, the declination was different than it is today. Compensating for this, I was able to take a bearing from this shaft over onto the hillside. And so I simply measured up from the stream bed and started digging on this bearing. It was incredible, but I actually, within 5 minutes, I hit signs that a mine might be there. I actually hit some chestnut planking that was covered in tar. Definitely part of an old timbered adit. Within 5 minutes, I couldn't believe it. So I dug a little bit farther and soon exposed top rock to this mine, which went on to become a very interesting find because we were able to use the ROV in the mine to find some intact original air piping, which I had never seen in any other mine before this one. And the air piping was made out of a box section of planks, and the ends were tapered and fit into another section. So using this old map and knowing how to calculate the difference between magnetic north in 1830 and magnetic north in 2021 made all the difference to this find. It couldn't have just been found by random digging. I needed to have this clue, which was certainly an exciting moment. So the seventh most memorable moment in the Lost Mines project was actually out while hiking the ridge of the Shawangunk Mountains looking for Lidar anomalies. So there are publicly available Lidar maps of New York State as well as Connecticut and Massachusetts and most eastern states in the US. So I was using these publicly available Lidar maps to look for anomalies that could be mines. So the reason I was up in this particular area was that one of the earliest mentions of mines in the colony of New Netherland was actually in the Shawangunk Mountains, a region that was called Bacon's Land in the 1600s. So there's a letter dated from 1659 that mentions a settler named Klaus de Ruyter who knew the location of many different mines up in Bacon's country, which is today the Shawangunk Mountains. And through my research, I've turned up more legends of lost mines in the Shawangunk Mountains than any other part of the East Coast United States. So this is quite an interesting region, and the mountain range that runs from Pahaquarry, New Jersey, roughly up to Ellenville, New York, is loaded with mines and mine prospects, and therefore lots of Lidar anomalies to check out. So of course I had to hike out and check out every single one of these anomalies, which involved quite a bit of hiking along this roughly 80-mile mountain ridge. So I was out hiking towards one of my coordinates to one of the Lidar anomalies, and it had gotten dark, so I decided just to set up camp right on the edge of this cliffside. So when I woke up in the morning, I realized I was perched over this huge valley that had filled with mist, and it was just a completely otherworldly scene as the sun came up and illuminated this valley that just looked like an ocean of mist. So if it wasn't for a nearby Lidar anomaly, I would really have no reason to camp at this specific point. So this made for a very memorable moment in my search for these lost mines. So the 8th most memorable moment was actually again in the Shawangunks, and I was hiking this ridge and I came across a Lidar anomaly which turned out to be a water-filled adit. Looking into the mine, there was only about a foot of airspace, but I knew that we could enter this mine using wetsuits and Lidar map it and explore the mine. So a few days before we were getting ready to explore this mine, I was doing some research. I actually found a newspaper article from 1898 that stated that a local girl who had lived near the mine, less than a mile away from the mine, was thought to have fallen in the mine into a flooded section and drowned. So this was a very tragic event. So they dredged a deep shaft or winze in this mine that was filled with water. Unfortunately, they never found a body. So our plan was to go into the mine and Lidar map it and then send the ROV down into any sort of flooded workings that we could find. So we entered the mine up to our neck in really cold mine water. So we eventually came to a winze that still had the remains of a windlass over it. But unfortunately, it was completely covered with heavy boards and rocks, and there wasn't even a space big enough that we could squeeze the ROV into to go down to see if we could find the remains of Mamie Conklin. So we'll be returning to this mine with a smaller ROV that will be able to squeeze between the cracks of the boards and go down and find out what's at the bottom of this flooded winze. So the 9th most memorable moment in the Lost Mines project was actually in a 1723 copper mine in the town of Woodbury, Connecticut. So a big question with any of these mines is, what was the ore that enticed these early settlers to expend all this time and money in driving these tunnels? What did they find that tipped them off? And this was a tough question to answer because most of the mines above the water table had been completely mined out and left really no samples of the ore that they found in the 1700s. So while excavating the floor of this early copper mine, we uncovered tons of low-grade copper ore. It was actually a copper mineral called chalcopyrite, and it sparkled like gold. It was really impressive to see bucketful after bucketful of this chalcopyrite coming out of this old mine. We brought the ore down to the Connecticut Museum of Mining and Mineral Science, and it was confirmed that there was chalcopyrite found in this mine. So this dig revealed a very important part of the history of this mine, and we now know that chalcopyrite was the main ore that was being removed from this tunnel here in Woodbury in the 1700s. So the 10th most memorable moment, and my favorite, was the reopening of the adit to the second oldest chartered copper mine in the English colonies. So of course there were copper mines that predate this one, but this one in particular was granted a charter by the colony of Connecticut, and with it there were lots of records and information kept on this mine, which makes its discovery that much more interesting. So we've dug open many different adits, both on the East Coast in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, as well as out west. And every one is always exciting. It's always an amazing experience to see a space that had been sealed off and lost to time. But this one was particularly exciting. So as I entered this mine for the first time, I started finding artifacts left in the tunnels. So the first thing I found were 2 wrought iron strap hinges and a hasp where a door once stood. So these would have fastened a door. The wood had since rotted away, leaving just the hinges. So we soon came to an intersection, but I kept going straight ahead, and placed on a rock on the side of the tunnel was a miner's set of tools. A drill steel, a sledgehammer head, and a mud spoon, just placed on this rock, just as it was left the day that that miner had walked out of the mine. To me, that was a moment where I could feel just time collapsing before me. Just feeling this sense of awe and wonder was incredible, feeling this connection to the past. So I've felt this collapse of time before at other sites, like going to Pompeii, for example, or seeing Ötzi the Iceman, who was pulled out of the ice on a glacier in Italy, and seeing his tools and everything just preserved as it was when he died. I felt the exact same sense of awe and wonder during this find. So I hope you enjoyed this video on the 10 most memorable moments in the Lost Mines project. And if you're interested in learning more about these mines, be sure to check out Mines and Mysteries. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe, and stay tuned for more finds in the Lost Mines project.